morning, finally, everybody. Hi. I mean, it's been a good morning, not just finally. Just it seems like it's been one of the more hectic. Hecticer? I'll go with that
Close
word.
enough.
If you make up your own word, it's a real word, right?
The Bible says hectare.
As Greg was pointing out to me a minute ago, the Bible says a lot of crazy, weird things. And I'm sure we can talk about some of those here in a minute. I did not get the basket. Bryce, would you get the basket and the names? If you guys are used to it, write your name on the slips and throw them in the basket. If you completed all of your reading for this week, again, you don't have to read it all each day. You could read it all last night, and I wouldn't tell anybody on you. Next week, we're going to do a drawing, and the first drawing is your best drawing because it doesn't have all of the collective names in it. Maybe, possibly. Anyway, so next week we'll do a drawing for something very special, and we'll give a prize away. But I think you have to be present to win. I think that's kind of the...
that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think that's kind of
It's
the
my
rule we're gonna
birthday
get.
and I'm going to Gillette. That's not fair.
Okay, well, if Sandy wins, she already complained about it, and it's not fair. All right. This week we read January 22nd through 28th. That's through yesterday, starting with last Sunday. We covered in Genesis chapter 44 through Exodus. We changed books into Exodus chapter 7, verse 24. And in the New Testament, we read Matthew 14 through 19:12. So we covered a lot of ground and covered a lot of stories. So kind of my quick recap to, I don't know, I'm trying very hard, but it's hard. We kind of picked back up with the story of Joseph where we left off last week. We left kind of the middle of the story of Joseph, right? But this week we see his brothers return to him, and Joseph reveals himself to them, and he throws a feast. And so he kind of communicates that, no, I'm not going to kill you or murder you or be mad at you, which is impressive, right? And then he sends off to bring the whole family here, including dad and wives and kids and everybody. He sends them back home with U-Hauls, right? With carts to bring everything and everyone back. But when they get there, dad, Jacob, he isn't sure about it all, right? I don't know if he's lacking belief that Joseph is really alive. We kind of read some of that. But he just doesn't know if he should do this. But God kind of ensures him that it's all going to be good. And so, through that insurance and assurance from God, they head back towards Joseph. In day 23, we get a bunch of the genealogy in the midst of the wrestling with God. Should I head back? And heading back to see Joseph, Jacob, and him reunite. But once Jacob and the family reunite with Joseph, Joseph takes care of them, right? He kind of sets some safeguards in place to make sure that that they're taken care of, that they can keep doing what they've done as shepherds, that they will have food. Remember, it's in the middle of a famine. Basically, gives them land, property, food, money, anything they might need, they are taken care of, right? Because Joseph is second in command over the whole kingdom. And then he also makes a promise to his dad that even though I live here in Egypt now, when I die, you will take me back to Canaan and bury me in my plot that I have set aside with family, right? So he promises his dad that. We also have Jacob taking the opportunity here in Egypt to bless Manasseh and Ephraim. And kind of where we end the story of Jacob is he passes. He passes while he is in the land of Egypt, right after he takes that moment with Manasseh and Ephraim. And it seems like he has a moment with everybody and then just passes on. He did it right? He had a moment with everybody and dies. So in day 25, Joseph takes his father back and buries him like he promised. While he's gone, the brothers are worried that now that dad is dead, when Joseph gets back, is this the time that he's finally going to snap and he's not going to be nice like he's pretending to be and he's going to kill us? Well, no, he's not going to do that. He comes back and he takes care of his family still, right? Nothing has changed just because dad has died. He still loves his brothers, even though they're the ones that sold him to slavery years ago. We see the rest of Joseph's life pass pretty quickly. we can see when he passes and kind of the genealogy of all of that. And then we take kind of a step back into seeing what's happening in history at that time. So a new king comes to power right after Joseph passes, from my understanding. Seems about right around there. And he doesn't have any regard for Joseph or his family. So these good deals and this taking care of that Joseph had set up, Joseph's gone, Pharaoh's gone, and now we're moving on to the next ruler. And he doesn't care about it. So instead of making their life good, Joseph and his people mean nothing to him, so he makes them slaves, right? He makes them slaves, and this is kind of our introduction to Moses. And we're going to head into Exodus, right? Moses is one of those Israelite babies that is born. Hebrew is now actually the term that we've heard for the first time in this little section. A Hebrew baby, but Hebrew baby boys were supposed to be killed, right? Hebrew baby boys weren't supposed to make it because there would be too many Hebrews in this land. So this is the start of Moses' story. If you don't know Moses' story, he's supposed to be killed, but he is, well, actually, Courtney and I figured this out. This is kind of interesting. They were supposed to be thrown into the Nile River. And technically Moses was, right? He just had a boat, which was pretty awesome. A basket covered in tar, right? And so when he's thrown into the Nile, he doesn't instantly die, but rather he floats. Give him a chance, right? And he's picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter's like, oh, baby, I'm a princess, right? And she's going to keep the baby and raise him up as an Egyptian Hebrew. But the story of Moses, I know you guys read it, but Moses' older sister was there watching him float down the river, and conveniently enough was right there when the princess found the baby. She said, hey, you need somebody to nurse it? And so Moses was still raised by his own mother for many years, right? And so that was kind of an interesting thing. So we talk about Moses a little bit as well. But when Moses gets older, he has a tension in his own life, being an Egyptian and a Hebrew at the same time, right? And so kind of the breaking point that we read about Moses is he kills the Egyptian slave driver that's treating his people badly, right? And I noticed this week, it was pre-planned. It wasn't like super pre-planned, but he made sure to look around and to kill this person and cover him up with sand. And so it wasn't just like a rage kill. It was thought through a little bit. So he kills the slave driver over the Hebrew. And through a chain of events, people knowing that he actually did it, Pharaoh finally getting wind of it and getting angry, obviously, he has to flee. He flees to Midian. So he's in Midian for a long time. While he's gone, things get worse, right? Hebrews are still slaves. They're still being used by the Egyptians. And God calls to Moses, speaks to him through a burning bush, and says, go back. Take care of your people. They are suffering, and you are not taking care of them. And Moses just, has a really respectful conversation with God where he's like, oh, yeah, I'll absolutely do that. No, he doesn't. And again, kind of the bargaining with God comes back out, right? Well, I'm not very good. I didn't go to speaking school or anything like that, so I don't think I better be the one to speak. So God gives him some signs. He kind of well, if you don't think you can speak, watch this. And he's got the sign of the staff. You can throw it down. It turns into a snake. You can pick it back up. It's a staff. And he gives him these signs so he can go back to Egypt and set the people free, right? But even with the signs, he's still kind of a little whiner. He's like, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know. I'm not really a good speaker. But he's kind of reluctantly going that direction, right? And I found it really interesting. He's wandering through the desert towards Egypt, and God is ready to kill him, is how the NIV says it. God was ready to kill him. And I don't know, we can wrestle with that a little bit, but it kind of feels like God was over this Moses guy. I'll figure something else out. You're just being a pain. But he redeems himself, or the woman redeems him for him by doing some weird circumcision thing and landing on his feet. I don't know why that pleased God, but either way, Moses didn't get killed, and Aaron gets picked up along the way. God says, fine, have Aaron. He can be the preacher. You can just be the signs guy, right? And so Aaron and Moses go to Egypt as the mouthpiece and the signs guy. And they get there. They make their claims. They do the snake and staff trick. And Pharaoh still doesn't believe, right? I find it interesting. Aaron actually ends up doing everything. So Moses is still kind of getting out of it, even though they're his people, right? But Pharaoh doesn't listen, and he actually makes it harder for the Hebrew people. I believe they're kind of the example we were given is make bricks, but you don't have any straw to do so. Go get your own straw, make as many bricks. See you at the end of the day with as many bricks. And they're like, okay, that's a very physical. We can understand that. Yeah, you need the main ingredient, but you got to go get it now. And so Moses just makes it harder. They perform the signs, and kind of where we end is even with crazy signs like turning the Nile to blood, they still don't listen. And that's right where we ended the story of Moses this week, kind of in the middle of his story. I think like the very last words that we read on yesterday, 28, where they had to dig holes next to the river to get water because the river was full of blood. So, pretty powerful sign. That's where we ended with Exodus this week. All right, Matthew. The story of Jesus continues. And he's doing some incredible miracles this week, if you guys didn't catch it. Very first thing we read about Jesus really doing in 22nd, on January 22nd this week, was Jesus feeds 5,000 people with what? 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? And then they pick it all up afterwards, and there's, correct me if I'm wrong because I mixed the stories, but I think this time there's 14 baskets left over. Now, I dropped out of engineering school, so I'm not the best at math, but I'm pretty sure this many people eat, and this much left over isn't how it works. So he does a miracle, right? So he feeds 5,000 people with just a few things. These were the crowds that were there hearing him listen, right? So kind of right after that, he tells the apostles to take off, they head across the water. He stays behind. He doesn't really explain to them how he's going to catch up, but he catches up, right? And he does it by going, super speed across the water, walking on it. He's walking on the water. And I love the apostles in the boat. Their response is, it's a ghost. That might be what my response is too. Things don't walk on water, last time I checked. So they call out, say it's a ghost, and Jesus reveals that it's him. And for just a moment, they believe, especially Peter, we kind of focus in on him. He believes that Jesus is walking on the water to him, so he calls out and he says, let me walk to you. And he does, for a minute, right? Until he looks around and he sees what the heck, I'm walking on water here. And he starts to sink. And Jesus calls him out for that. And this will be the theme that we kind of see this week. He calls him out and he says, where is your faith? It's because you lost faith, you lost sight of me, that you started sinking. Calls him out for his lack of faith. Again, that's the theme we'll see over and over this week. Day 23, we kind of go back to Jesus and the disciples teaching and healing. And Jesus starts to get called out more by our very favorite Pharisees, right? The first calling out they gave this week is, Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat? And Jesus, in his typical fashion, responds with yet another question. He says, why do you break the laws of God to follow your traditions? They're probably like, oh, we're just talking about washing our hands. Why you got to call us out like that, right? So he kind of points it back to them and he says, what you're doing is you're going against God so you can fulfill what you want, right? Your laws. And he gives them teaches them through this story about it's not what goes in your mouth that defiles, but it's what comes out of your mouth that defiles. And it's kind of interesting that he gives this story because they're really worried about what goes in the mouth, right? That's literally the washing of hands problem. Dirty, gross, germy bread, right? Oof. Jesus says, actually, you're too worried about dirty hands making dirty bread that you forget that it's actually what comes out of your mouth and your heart that matters. And so he teaches this. Not sure if they get it because the apostles don't. And the apostles are kind of like, what are you talking about? dirty hands coming out of your mouth, coming into your mouth. And Jesus says, snarkily, I think Kim was right. Kim told me on Friday that Jesus is kind of snarky in this section of Scripture. He kind of says, you are dull. He uses that word in the NIV. You are dull. They're like, what? What do you mean? Can you explain this to us? So he explains how it's your heart that produces what comes out, right? And it's rather than what comes in, it's what comes out. He explains this to them. He explains to them it's not actually about washing hands. It's about being careful against what the Pharisees are teaching. And he actually uses the example of leaven. So he takes it back to bread and he says, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. So something that will change your whole batch. It'll leaven your whole batch. That's what the Pharisees are teaching. Kind of in the midst of this, we have the Canaanite woman. Her daughter is sick, I believe. Let me make sure I don't have these backwards. The Canaanite daughter, the Canaanite woman's daughter is sick, and she comes to Jesus with great faith, asking for her daughter to be healed. And in the midst of all of this doubting by the apostles, Jesus says, this woman right here, she has great faith, right? She came to me knowing that I could heal her daughter, who's not even here. He doesn't say it just like that, but in the midst of that, she has great faith opposed to the apostles who are dull and have little faith, right? And we'll see that theme continuing to happen. Jesus also performs another miracle, feeding 4,000 people this time with 7 bread, loaves, and a couple of fish, or a few fish, depending on your translation. And again, that's not how math works. That's a miracle, no doubt. And it's so funny to me. Right after that, the apostles are heading down the road, and they realize they forgot to bring dinner. And then Jesus says, guys, you just saw me perform miracles with food, and you're worried about dinner? You're worried about dinner? About what you have for bread? And again, he teaches them about the Pharisees and the leaven in this situation, right? So he's helping them refocus on what really they should be fighting. Not food, but rather the Pharisees and the false teachers. In day 25, Jesus asks them, who am I? And they kind of give the response of what people say. But he says, what do you say? And Peter says, hey, you are the Lord Christ, right? And Jesus says, that's right, Peter, good job. One thing from you. And so he uses that opportunity to talk about his death and resurrection. He's starting to tell them what's going to happen now, right? But Peter responds, and it's just seeing the character of Peter is incredible. Peter responds, no, Lord, I will never let that happen. It's like he almost grabs his sword while he's saying it, right? I won't let anybody take you. And he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. And there's some interesting stuff there, but I think it's because Jesus is telling them the plan that has to happen, the good plan, and Peter can't see the goodness in it. He can only see his good friend being taken away. So he actually takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountaintop for an experience, I guess you'd say, and we can talk about that a little bit. But they see Jesus, Moses, and Elijah all up there, and Peter offers to build them each a tent. But Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach that he is greater than even Moses and Elijah, right? But he tells them, don't tell anybody until after this crucifixion and resurrection that I've been telling you about, right? Again, he teaches them of his death, burial, and resurrection. He gets on to them again about their faith being lacking because they have the man who comes with his son who's demon-possessed. And he says, your disciples, they couldn't do anything about it. And Jesus says, yep, it's because their faith is lacking. And it's like, again, he's kind of getting that snarkiness at the apostles because they are lacking in faith even though they're walking with Jesus, right? Then they ask him a question on day 27. Who is the greatest among all of the kingdom of heaven? Like they're kind of expecting a response like Abraham or Moses or Elijah, right? And Jesus says, those like little children. And I think they're probably really taken aback by that and just like, what? And he uses this as another time to teach them. Those like little children, innocent, following, believing, trusting. Right? He doesn't use those words, that's Harold there, but those trusting like little children and just walking with the Father, don't you be the one to cause that person to stumble. Don't you be the one to cause a little child to stumble. And he uses the example of leaving the 99 sheep to go find the lost one, because it is worth the effort and the risk to find the one lost sinner or sheep. And he's paralleling that with the children, with sinners, and with sheep, kind of all together. And he's saying, everybody is worth it, right? Everybody is worth it to the Father. And they're still kind of wrestling through, what does that mean? Because in our last day, yesterday, day 28, Peter asked the question, he's still trying to wrestle with what that means. And he says, so should I forgive somebody like 7 times? Like, that's a lot. I get it, Peter. Like, 7 times? That's a lot of times. And Jesus says, depending on your translation, the impact is still the same. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Or your Bible might say 77 times. Either way, it's more than Peter wanted to hear, right? He thought 7 was like exorbitant. But Jesus uses this as a teaching moment to teach the apostles and Peter that God forgives everyone, a lot or a little. It doesn't matter if you have 7 or 77 sins that you need forgiven of, or the same one over and over again. God is going to forgive you. So, if you want to be forgiven like that, you need to forgive like that, right? Not cause the little children to stumble. Go find the lost sheep and forgive time and time again. He's kind of putting them all together there over the past few days. And then where we end, and we can have discussion after this, the Pharisees are trying to trick him again with a divorce question. It's almost like they know that divorce questions will be the ones to try and trick teachers, right? And so they say, teacher, is it all right to divorce your wife? It's like this is no right answer, no matter what he says, right? But he says, well, hold on a second. You guys should all know this. In the very beginning, God created them male and female, and when they joined together, they became one. And what God has made one, let no man separate. Well, but how come we are allowed to divorce then? And Jesus says, well, in the time of Moses, you were allowed to divorce for, whatever reasons. You draw up the paperwork, here it is. But I tell you, no one should divorce their wife unless there's adultery. And he gives a little out there, so you can talk about that if you want. But really, no one should separate what God has put together. And their response to, well, if I can't get a divorce is this. Well, if I can't get a divorce, I just shouldn't even get married. And that kind of made me laugh. It's like, oh, if you can't get a divorce, you shouldn't even get married? What's up with that? But, so Jesus says, yeah, that's kind of true. If you're strong enough, there's people, and he gives examples of eunuchs, those that have been that way from birth, those that have chosen the lifestyle. And he says, if you choose to do that, more power to you, right? He doesn't use those words, but more power to you. But he's drawn it back to their original question of, if you're joined by God, you're not permitted to choose when you separate. You're joined by God, right? All right, that's the recap. I'm not getting better at making these shorter. I'm sorry. What things popped out to you guys today, and what did you notice this past week, either in Matthew or Genesis, Exodus?
A lot of things.
Really, lots of things.
Again, lots of bargaining with God, especially like you look at Moses. He's kind of a little whiner baby.
I didn't realize that because I thought Moses had such a much bigger story because, obviously, Moses, even not in the church. So,
Yeah,
reading that story, I was like, are you sure that's the same Moses? Like, what?
well, and I think part of the thing is we always expand these stories and give them as kids' stories and whatnot, and we give every detail and this is the story. But when you read it in the mix of God's whole big plan here, you're like, that was only half a day. We're moving on, It was no big deal because I'm seeing the whole plan unfold. Moses is just a small part of it. Sandy?
The whole plan is huge when you look back in the Psalms and Proverbs. David talking about my hands will be pierced and
Yeah, I was
all
just saying.
those other things. Everything in the Bible is pointing to Jesus, either coming or coming back, or both.
So one you might find really familiar that Sandy is kind of referencing here is in day 26 is Psalm 22. And that might sound really, really familiar to you because this is what Jesus says as his final moments on the cross. So David is writing a song to God, and his song says, my God, why have you forsaken me? What does that sound like? That's what Jesus says on the cross. And basically the rest of this psalm describes what Jesus is enduring in his final moments on the cross, right?
A commentary I looked at pointed out that crucifixion wasn't even a thing when David was king. So where did that come from? It's just
Right.
pure prophecy.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I was going to say too, when Jesus is saying this on the cross, he's like quoting their songs. He's like quoting their worship songs, and they would know exactly what this means. This would be something they sang, right? And so he's quoting it.
Still didn't believe.
Dennis.
And to piggyback on what she said, there are these skeptics and scoffers that say, and there's some places, I will admit, through the Gospels, where maybe it said he did this to fulfill prophecy, and maybe, well as he knew the scriptures, some were some things he could do on purpose, you know.
Sure.
Can you imagine a guy going through what he did on his dying breath? Let's see, I gotta come out with another witty saying. Yeah. And then he says that, but she just, you know, to quote David, that ain't the kind of thing a guy would say on his dying breath, to help be a good fake, you know.
Yeah. What was that I was supposed to say? What was the script?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
dying, but what was that script? I got 2 breaths. One of them is going to be remembering.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. We'll go Dan and then Kim.
What I thought was what I found was kind of cool was, you hear about how patient God is, and it's pretty evident with Moses going back and forth with God, because God actually wanted to strike him down, and then he gets angry with him too.
Yeah.
But he doesn't give up on him. He just keeps it, keeps at it.
That was the
Patience.
fascinating point, like I mentioned with Moses. Fascinating to me because, I don't know, I guess we don't often see God right at the line of patient or you're over. But with Moses, he was kind of like right on that line a couple of times, right? But especially when he's ready to kill him. I just think that's hilarious. I'm like, huh. He's like, Moses is right there on the line with God. Not a good place to be, right? You want to be served, but yes, on to Dan's point, especially Moses was a display of God's patience, for sure. Kim, are you Old Testament? Or New Testament?
Yeah.
New, okay.
So my comment was gonna be like, it's kind of funny how like these people that are walking with Jesus, they're supposed to have like the most faith and they're supposed to be believing, and like they're the ones that have the least faith.
Yes.
Like they're the ones that just keep like annoying Jesus. Like he's got some patience too, because the fact that it's like I probably would have stopped the person and just like stop it. Do what you're told.
It is pretty funny because we're given examples like 3 times in this reading of people that have never encountered Jesus before having the most faith in this story, right? So the Canaanite woman and her daughter who's sick, the man whose son is demon possessed. Say there's a third one, I can't remember what it is. And each time Jesus takes care of their need, and then he turns around and basically says to the apostles, this is what faith looks like. You should do that, right? Get it together. And I mean, he tells them, this is where the verse in Matthew that people like to quote all the time is, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can move that mountain. He's telling that to the apostles, right? Not to take it away from you and I, but he's telling that to the apostles because they are lacking in faith, but yet they're the ones walking right beside him, seeing everything each and every day. Demons being pulled out of people, girls being healed that aren't even there. They should have tons of faith.
Well, one of the fun ones that I noticed there was one of the not exposed to him before. Initially, when she asked for healing, he at first said no, and then she made the case about the dog getting the crumbs, yada yada yada. So you don't typically discuss Christ's,
withholding from anyone and then taking it a little bit of convincing, but it really wasn't a matter of taking convincing, it was
Matter
building
of
that
showing
case
faith.
back to his apostles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so this is kind of the end of Matthew in day 23, but Jesus did not answer a word. So that's Jesus not answering, like JD's saying in verse 23. So his disciples came with him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying. She's still whining. She's still here," right? He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. And he replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said, "even if the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." So he uses this as a display, like JD's saying, of great faith. Right there in front of the apostles. Greg and then Dennis.
When Jesus was talking about the mustard seed, wasn't the disciples having trouble removing a demon from somebody?
Yep. And
And Nicodemus had that same thing, and Jesus kind of said the same thing to both of them, right? The lack of faith.
Yeah, he pinpoints that the lack of being able to cast out the demon. He pinpoints that to their faith, right? Again, I think he's using this as a teaching moment for them. Like Kim started this little piece with, it's crazy to see the ones that should see it can't see it and lack faith. But how often is that true with humans? You know, humans can be so close and miss everything. Dennis?
Some of my charismatic or Pentecostal friends I've had over the years have said, yeah, we're more apt to believe Jesus and obey him and end up in heaven if we can see a miracle or two now and then, and we've seen just now from the little bit of discussion we've done on just this little bit of Moses and this little bit from the Gospels, these people had seen hundreds of huge, real, genuine miracles, and 5 minutes later, they still don't trust him. They still don't believe it. So that deal that, and Jesus says somewhere that it's a hard-hearted people that seeketh the sign. It's not good people and the best people. It's hard-hearted and evil people that always want to see another sign to prove it. No matter how many already done did, that ain't enough. You get addicted to miracles, I guess, and then just like any addiction, you get numb. Pretty soon it takes a bigger and bigger pill to get that same buzz.
Yeah, it's again, that's why the bread one is so funny to me, is because Jesus has just performed miracles of like making food out of thin air. And then the very next thing we see from the apostles is, "Oh no, we forgot to bring dinner, we're gonna starve." And Jesus is like, "Guys, were you here with me today?" It's like, I don't want to be dishonorable to Christ or to God the Father, but both of them in these readings is kind of just like, guys, a little bit.
There's your sign.
There's your sign. There you go, right? There's your sign. Like, yeah, absolutely. One thing I caught in the Old Testament, and I don't know why, you're going to think I'm a really bad Bible student now. I guess I never connected the dots between Joseph and Moses and the Hebrews being held in captive, right? And so Joseph brings his whole family. These are the Hebrews before they're called Hebrews. He brings his whole family to Egypt, and life is good. He is blessed. He is over the kingdom, and he dies. The ruler dies. Things change. We read that. And then we shift into Moses' story, and who are these people who are enslaved in Egypt? These are the descendants of Joseph and his father and his brothers, right? And they're growing in number. Exponents are, they're being a nation now, not just a family. And I guess I had never connected the fact that it was Joseph and his descendants that he brought back to Egypt that are here in just a minute, the ones enslaved by Egypt, and Moses has to set free. I don't know, I always kept those two stories separate. I don't know if there's a chapter break there, and for some reason Harold thought that, but there's definitely, we go from Genesis to Exodus, so maybe that's why it's separated. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. They're the same story continued. Kim?
So back to the Old Testament, so there's always people who like comment on the fact that, so Joseph, like, he he's mean to his family when they find him, and he's kind of, but it kind of seems like he's acting that way in order to get them so they can follow him. And he tells them, you know, if you wouldn't have sold me and all this bad stuff wouldn't have happened to me, we wouldn't be where we're at.
Yeah, it's kind of like blessings from the, and in fact, the whole family gets to enjoy that, basically, right? Because the example he uses right then is, if it wasn't for you basically trying to kill me and sell me off into slavery, we would all be starving right now. But I have been placed with this power from God and this role, and now you guys are taken care of, which is true. It's kind of crazy to think about. People do like to pick on the fact that Joseph was mean to his family, but then he also blessed them for the rest of their generations. So, I don't know.
Yeah, but
Take-
like if you read it, like I said, he tells them what to tell the Pharaoh too, so it's kind of like he's playing it like, okay, I can't let you know until
Yeah,
afterwards, so that way I can get you here.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and he does kind of play like a game with them back and forth, right? Especially when you look at the money's back in the sacks, you know, like we should have paid for this grain, you know, things like that. That's kind of playing with them. But again, it was kind of to test them as well. What else did you guys see this week? I had one more thing, but I'm trying to figure out where it's at. Larry, and then I'll go to the back here.
Another good lesson that we haven't talked about much is what you read in Matthew regarding the unclean hands breaking bread. And it's a good lesson for us as living human beings to be able to see the difference between spiritual versus physical. And it's hard for us to do that oftentimes.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point too, because we still struggle with this sometimes, right?
All the time.
All the time, yeah. It's kind of like a human condition where we make physical needs and spiritual needs, we kind of morph them together. And we see a lot of pseudo-spiritual things that are like physical, spiritual morphins, right? And so that's why some people, again, even on the simple things, like some substances we use we think are spiritual, but really they're just physical, right? We have that kind of cross problem there. And you see it in religion all the time too. Doing physical things because you think they're spiritual, it's like, man, I don't know, you gotta be careful with that. And so that's why we'll always be careful to teach only what the Bible teaches on that, right? If there's a physical thing the Bible teaches, that'll be the physical thing. But other than that, we don't need to add to that, I guess you could say. I'll be careful with how I say that, but yeah, absolutely. Dennis, did you have another comment? We got
Yeah,
a few
one thing
minutes
I
here.
noticed is something we've kind of seen through our studies in the New Testament and Acts and things like that is, you know, like the Pharisees and Sadducees at each other's throat, and then they'll unite on some things when it comes to dealing with an outsider. And we've seen a quick example of that with those two guys fighting, and Moses interrupted them.
Yep.
And it sounds but like the context, like they were really going after it, either with words or fists or whatever. And then he kind of breaks, hey, who are you, and whatnot, you know. And then they were almost, you know, like united on that, keeping him.
Yeah.
Who are you to boss us around? What do
You're
you
not
think?
doing any good.
And we see it all through the scriptures, and someplace even Jesus and the apostles used that feud, antagonism in their favor, and sometimes it was just, but they would always come back together, no matter how they were fighting like cats and dogs, doctrinally and everything else. The Sadducees and Pharisees would come back together when it come to taking care of that imposter sect, the Christians or their Christ.
Yeah, he kind of uses the team against him to work together, which is kind of funny, right? Absolutely. One of the stories I found, I guess, kind of impactful from Jesus is, let me make sure I find the right day here. It's in day 26. Again, the Pharisees, there's some subcontext here about Jesus paying taxes, right? The subcontext is, does your teacher pay taxes? And so Peter kind of takes charge of this one. He says, absolutely he does. I'll make sure that's taken care of, right? Taking care of things for Jesus. That's what Peter liked to do. So Peter and Jesus seem to kind of have a little sidebar. And Jesus asks Peter, he says, does it make sense for the king's son to pay taxes? Basically, right? And Peter says, no, he's royalty. He's the king's son. That doesn't make any sense. And Jesus kind of doesn't say a whole lot about that. He just says, exactly. But to not offend anybody, why don't you go get tax money? Here's how you're going to do it. You're going to go fishing, and you're going to pull double the money you need out of the fish's mouth. And he does, and he pays the taxes, right? Kind of a quick and simple story. Not a lot is said by Jesus, but there's just a couple of things that really stood out to me. Jesus' answer of, does the royal son have to pay taxes to the king? Well, of course not, because he's royalty, right? Jesus is saying, why would I give a temple tax? I am the Son of God. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, I can't give myself money through other organizations and expect to get it back. But then he also does this part. This is the part that was impactful to me. He still pays the tax. And his whole reasoning behind paying the tax is not to offend someone. So I took home a lot from that, and the fact that you can know something stupid and wrong and pointless, but even the example from Jesus was he still served to not offend, even if he knew it was pointless. So sometimes I need to be better at that. Like, we always think of Jesus, and he truly was. He was a rebel, a shaker, against the Pharisees and against religion. But there's also times when he did things to not offend them, purposely. So I thought that was kind of interesting. One last comment from anybody? Kind of a slim crowd, but good comments today.
Kind of was a little blown away by when Jesus was telling the story about him going to Jerusalem, and he was going to suffer. Let's see, Matthew, why it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and suffer terrible things at the hand of elders, and blah. And then Peter took him aside and reprimanded him, saying things, heaven forbid, Lord, he said, this will never happen to you. This is the comment that really, Jesus turned to Peter and said, get away from me, Satan. You are a dangerous trap to me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view. So, what I'm thinking is just how serious that is. You know, I don't really understand why there was such harsh words, but it's pretty serious.
Absolutely, yeah.
Peter didn't understand.
Peter didn't get it, right? And that's why I think it is harsh words when we read it, right? Because he says, get behind me, Satan, to Peter. But I think the reason he says that is because if Peter did actually what he's all gung-ho about doing, pulling the sword out, I won't let anybody take you and kill you. It would be the work of Satan, right? Because Jesus needs to die on the cross. That's the plan that God has set in motion. And so I know it's like, that's a mean thing to say to Peter, one of your right-hand men, But he's telling him, don't act as Satan in this. This is the plan. I'm supposed to die and resurrect. I just told you. Don't try and fight that, right? And again, snarky Jesus coming out a little bit. But really, if Peter enacted that, it would have been Satan working, right? So he's saying, no, don't take a hold of Peter right now. You don't get that option. Get behind him. Get behind me. So yeah. All right, guys. All right. Greg, last comment, and then we'll stop before we head into services here.
Jesus had mentioned to Peter how Satan wanted to sift him. And for Peter, he loved, that was his everything. And he just got hammered. But in that last meal, and Jesus said that to him, I mean, he had to be humbled quite a few times.
Yes, Peter gets humbled often.
He was a warrior.
Yes.
And then like we talked about a few months ago, how his personality after he denied Christ, when he was told he was going to, how he just kind of disappeared, and then all of a sudden we see him on fire again.
Yeah.
And Peter, geez, Hey,
Yeah, he's a real human. Yeah,
he's
that's
a
kind
real
of the
human
fun
being.
part.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we'll end there. Next week, we'll pick up with today in the one-year Bible. So today's the 29th, and read until Saturday night next week, and we'll talk about that then. See you guys in a few minutes for services.